time during the Second World War, I was listening to a talk on the radio. The speaker was a very old lady and was treating us to some of her reminiscences. She told us that when she was about 10 years old, she visited an elderly great-aunt who plied her with tales of the stirring times through which she had lived. I remember one that fascinated me very much. The great-aunt remembered when she was a schoolgirl being taken with her school to watch the magnificent funeral procession of Lord Nelson, killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. They were lined up outside St. George's Hospital at Hyde Park Corner and given handkerchiefs with black borders with which to dab their eyes as Nelson's coffin was borne past them on a funeral car pulled by 6 black horses from the Royal Mews. The speaker on the radio said that, like most little girls of her age, she did not listen very attentively to the interesting reminiscences of her relatives, and that she regretted this very much. Alas, I can identify with her completely. The following family snapshots are often out of focus and incomplete, due to my failure as a listener and observer. However, such as they are, I dedicate them to you, dear family, past and present. To Joan and Barry, John and Jill, Martin and Sue, Judy and David, David and Pat, Michael and Janet, Catherine, Nicholas and Charles, Andrew, Deborah, Claire, James, Richard, Rebecca and Peter. My thanks and appreciation to John for the family tree. It was a tremendous help. One of the tricks that Mother Nature plays on you as you grow old is that while you can remember events that happened to you at a very young age, it is impossible to remember the contents of a book read and enjoyed only a few days ago. For instance, I remember at the age of 3, climbing out of my cot, making my way down 2 flights of stairs, and surprising my family and guests as they were having dinner. We were staying at Killerton, my grandparents' large house at Eastbourne, and the dinner party was being conducted in regal splendour. For a while I was unnoticed, except by the smartly dressed parlour-maids, who gave me friendly smiles as they passed to and fro with the steaming silver dishes. My grandfather, known as Gramps, was a doctor, and rather forbidding, a condition caused in part by a combination of secretiveness and extreme shyness. As I stood in the open doorway, taking in the elegant surroundings, my grandfather's voice boomed out above the murmur of conversation. "There's a child at the door." Astonished faces were turned in my direction, and my mother, resplendent in ivory satin, rose from her place to lead me away from the dining room into the hall. Together we sat on the thickly carpeted stairs, while she explained to me that bedtime was a time for sleeping, and not for satisfying my curiosity as to what the rest of the family were doing. I was then led back to my cot by a sympathetic parlour-maid, in the pause between the fish and the entree. As I grew older, the shadowy figures dining at Killerton took on more substance, except perhaps for Granny, who died in 1924. Latterly she was confined to a wheelchair, or a bath chair as it was called in those days, a magnificent wickerwork construction, and known to us as the Killerton Express. I remember trotting beside it on the front at Eastbourne, while its occupant was taken for an airing by the nurse who attended her daily. One of the most interesting of our relations dining at Killerton that long ago evening was Granny's sister, Auntie Alice. She was an artist of considerable talent. She and a group of artist friends used to go on painting holidays together, setting up their easels wherever a paintable view presented itself. Auntie Alice always worked in oils, and liked to work alone, and I remember a picture of hers of a river scene we had at home, which was painted in a remote part of Devonshire with a thunderstorm approaching. She told us once that while she was painting that picture, a group of children from the nearest village gathered round and began to throw stones at her. "Whatever did you do?" Mother asked. "I just went on painting," Alice replied. "They soon got tired of it." In Victorian and Edwardian times, when house parties were de rigueur, Alice was much in demand as a house guest at some of the stately homes. I remember listening fascinated to her stories of a vanished age. The splendour and opulence far outshone Killerton, and certainly was unknown to the northern suburb of London where I was growing up. Alice was a first-class raconteur, and one of her stories has remained with me ever since. It seems she was staying in a very old country house, and after retiring for the night was in bed and reading by candlelight. It was past midnight, and she was about to lay down her book when she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. She sat bolt upright to listen, and the footsteps continued along the corridor towards her room. Outside her door they stopped, and the door handle was turned back and forth several times before the footsteps continued on. Alice was out of bed in a flash, and carrying her candle went to the door to confront her visitor. A full moon was shining through a large window on the landing, and the long corridor was well lit, but it was quite empty. The next morning, when the house guests were tucking in to the lavish breakfast provided in those days, Alice recounted her strange experience. She saw her host and hostess exchange a startled glance, and then the host, with a hearty laugh, said, "Nonsense, Alice dear, just your artistic imagination, eh? What?" And the hostess quickly began giving details of the plans to entertain the guests that day. Later that evening, when the guests were assembled in the drawing-room, and all the footmen and the parlour-maids had departed, someone mentioned what a beautiful old house it was. Of course, he said, the only thing that would make it quite perfect would be if you had a ghost. "Oh, but we have," said the hostess. "No one has ever seen it, but it has been heard a number of times," said the host. "It always walks up the stairs and along the corridors to one of the guest rooms and tries the door handle. In fact, you heard it last night, Alice." "Well," said Alice, somewhat put out, "why did you tell me it was my imagination?" "Because," explained the hostess, "some of the servants were present, and if they knew the house was haunted, they would all leave immediately." I remember asking my father what he thought of Auntie Alice's ghost story. He thought for a moment and then said, "Rats. Those old houses are infested with rats." Unfortunately, I found this to be true. During World War II, I was billeted in a large Tudor house in Hampshire, which had to employ its own rat-catcher. I can't think that he was very efficient, as the rats used to run along the tops of the radiators at night. But I never experienced them turning doorknobs back and forth. Alice was born in 1858, the daughter of John Farrar Woodruff and Harriet Dobbs. In 1898 she married Fred Winkley. I know nothing about him except that Auntie Alice had a large clock on her mantelpiece bearing an engraved plaque with the message that it had been presented to Fred Winkley, but for what reason I can't remember. Soon after they were married, I believe it was a matter of weeks, they decided to take a boat out on a river. For some reason the boat tipped over and they were thrown into the water. Some people on the bank managed to grab hold of Alice, who was calling out, "Fred, where is Fred?" As they pulled her ashore, her rescuers tried to calm her and said, "He's all right, he'll be here directly." But he had been drowned. I remember Auntie Alice in the 20s and 30s living at Fleet in Hampshire. She had a little Victorian cottage called Elsa Dean, and was looked after by a devoted family retainer called Dame. We used to drive over from Hillingdon on Sunday afternoons to have tea with her. She was getting on a bit by then, and had very curly white hair and a merry smile. I remember how pretty the cottage was, and how the French windows would be open to let in the perfume of a large bed of phlox, Alice's favourite flower. She had a beautiful set of china, which she had designed and painted herself, and I remember how attractive the sitting room was, with its soft colours and its view of the garden. Among Alice's many friends was G. Coulton, Don of St. John's College, Cambridge. He was the subject of a hate poem by Hilaire Belloc, because of some derogatory remarks he had written about G.K. Chesterton. It began, "Remote and ineffectual Don, who dared attack my Chesterton. With that poor weapon half impelled, unlearnt, unsteady, hardly held, unworthy for a tilt with men, your quavering and corroded pen." It goes on for 4 long verses of vitriolic insults, and ends, "My fires are banked, but still they burn, to write some more about the Don that dared attack my Chesterton." Auntie Alice was very much of the ancien regime, and would not tolerate bad manners or slovenly speech. Mother used to say that when she came back from Australia she had picked up an Australian accent, and said things like "kike" instead of cake. Alice, horrified, would correct her, no matter who was present at the time. Granny and Alice had a brother, William Woodruff, who married Chiquetta Gould, who was Gramps' sister. Out of their 6 children, the one I knew best was Cousin Winnie. She had immense charm, and was like Auntie Alice to look at, growing more like her as she grew older. The most striking thing about her was her brilliant blue eyes. She was always beautifully dressed and well groomed, even when old. As John said after she died, she went down with all flags flying. She was educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College in the days of the great Dorothea Beale, who with her colleague, Miss Buss, was responsible for advancing education for women. You probably know the little ditty that goes, "Miss Buss and Miss Beale, Cupid's darts do not feel. How different from us, Miss Beale and Miss Buss." Winnie married Fred Watson, who was in the army and rose to be a general. Father said he would have risen even further if his behaviour hadn't been so foolish. In spite of his military-looking exterior, he had the mind of a naughty 10-year-old. He never seemed to take anything seriously. He and Winnie spent many years in India, and it was only after they returned to England and they visited us at Hillingdon frequently that I got to know them. During the war, Winnie was determined to join up. She was then in her 50s, so she lied about her age and applied to the WAF. Unfortunately, she forgot to lie about the date of her marriage, so a chit came back from headquarters. This applicant appears to have been married at the age of 8. However, she was accepted and looked very smart in her uniform. I remember how appalled she was at her fellow recruits, who came from a very different background. She stuck it out for a while, but when her real age was discovered, she was allowed to retire with honour. Fred and Winnie had 2 sons, Dick and Graham. I have only a vague recollection of Dick. I know he married and had a family. Graham, on the other hand, I saw quite often. He was involved with the theatre as a designer. He had Auntie Alice's sense of colour and design, and in the parlance of today, he was gay. He and Winnie were devoted to each other, and I once went with Winnie to his little flat behind Charing Cross Hospital. We spent a cosy evening gossiping about the theatre, with Graham coming out with remarks like, "As Larry Olivier said to me," or "as I said to John Gielgud," while Winnie listened benignly. During our departure, I noticed a huge soup tureen on a small table in his tiny hall. I made some remark about it, and Graham said, "That, dear, is my spode commode." The rest of the family looked on Graham with a certain amount of indulgent humour. They said that in middle age he was always referring to Winnie as Mummy, even to complete strangers. But I appreciated his exquisite taste and his knowledge and love of the theatre. As children, we spent most summer holidays at Eastbourne. Gramps, now retired, lived with his daughter, Auntie Gladys, at 27 Upperton Gardens, a dark, damp and dreary late Victorian house. After they had lived there a while, Gramps came home one day and said he had bought another house in Upperton Gardens, number 50, and that they would be moving next week. He never discussed it with Auntie Gladys, or let her see it first. Not that she would have objected to the move, or to his choice of the house. She was brought up to believe that father knows best, and it never occurred to her that as she was to live in the house, she should at least have been consulted about it. The semi-detached house was 3 stories high, and some of it was as dank and sunless as number 27. However, the front faced west and enjoyed the afternoon sun, and being on top of a hill, you could just see the ridge of the South Downs rising above the roofs of houses on the other side of the gardens. We didn't spend much time in the house during our holidays. Every morning we set out with bathing suits, buckets and spades and shrimping nets for the beach. Auntie accompanying us with towels and a picnic lunch which never varied. Fish paste sandwiches. Upperton Gardens was about a mile from the sea, and to get to it we had to trudge through the town, emerging at the lifeboat station near where our beach tent was kept. You were not allowed to undress on the beach in those days unless you did so in a beach chalet or a tent. Our tent was a square wooden frame over which fitted some coloured canvas. Although it could be folded up quite neatly, it was heavy to carry and to assemble. It was kept under lock and key when not in use, so had to be collected every day from the attendant, who of course was not available to offer any kind of help. Fortunately, Auntie Gladys, although small and thin, was extremely strong and wiry, and in no time the tent was pitched and ready for business. Our enjoyment of the beach depended largely on the tides. If the tide was out, we had a vast expanse of sand on which to build sandcastles, or rock pools to explore and search for shells, or to push our shrimping nets along the shallow water's edge, where an abundance of shrimps were to be found. High tide, of course, was not so exciting, except that it was better for swimming, because sitting on a hard, pebbly beach has its disadvantages. So, while waiting for the tide to go out, we might go for a walk along the front, savouring the delights of the seaside during the holiday season. We once went on a boat trip to the lighthouse at Beachy Head, a trip enlivened by the view of rescuers clambering down the cliffs with a stretcher to pick up the body of someone who had committed suicide. Unfortunately, Beachy Head was a favourite spot for such an enterprise. Sometimes Gramps would appear, immaculately dressed and wearing a large Homburg hat, to inspect our sandcastles or to watch us while we pursued our seaside occupations. He never said much, but I always felt he was genuinely fond of us, in spite of the difficulty he had in showing it. I remember once, when I was about 9 years old, I had to go to the London hospital for an operation on my eye. As I lay swathed in a bandage over my left eye, I was suddenly aware of him standing by my bed and holding my hand. He barely said a word, and after a little while he was gone. A short, stocky man with dark hair and a pock-marked face, the result of smallpox suffered as a young man. I remember that when he could bring himself to talk to us, he had a very attractive speaking voice. He had a lady friend called Miss Brown, whom he visited regularly. She was rather large and plain and wore pince-nez. It's difficult to imagine that it was a romantic attachment. I think the attraction was the comfort and companionship her home provided compared to his own. Auntie Gladys could not be described as a homemaker. She was a childlike person who may have suffered brain damage as a baby when she was dropped on her head by a nurse who was drunk. She was just able to read and write, but never to spell, and that was the extent of her education. She was never given any special help, but was sent to an ordinary school where she sat at the back of the class while the contents of the lessons went over her head. If she had had the advantages that children with similar problems have today, who knows how much her life might have been enriched. As it was, she was severely limited in many areas. All the more extraordinary, therefore, that the family always expected her to behave like a normal person. Elderly relatives, Auntie Alice among them, would descend on her, in sickness or in health, after Gramps died, and expect to be nursed and cared for and given nourishing meals at regular intervals. This was quite beyond her capabilities, and when her patients and visitors found that meals, nourishing or otherwise, were seldom forthcoming, they would depart, pouring their disappointment and anger upon her bewildered head. And yet, in many ways, she was surprisingly gifted. In spite of her slightly deformed hands, she was able to make things that absolutely delighted us as children. I remember 2 dolls' houses she made out of orange crates. Each room had different wallpaper on the walls and rugs on the floors. She even made the furniture and the little family of occupants. They gave us endless pleasure. I also remember a gollywog she made for me out of an old black stocking. He had a blue coat and red waistcoat and striped trousers, and a smiling face beneath a mop of black woolly hair. She could turn her hand to so many things, and was able to follow the most complicated knitting patterns to good effect. Knitting and sewing was something our mother never mastered, in spite of being a homemaker par excellence. I will never forget Mother trying to teach me how to knit. I wanted to learn how to do stocking stitch, but although she knew how to purl, it didn't come out as we had hoped. Suddenly, Father, who had been sitting in an armchair reading the paper, began singing an old Edwardian music hall song. I forget the words, but it was something like, "There was I knitting in the churchyard, 1 row plain and 1 row purl." "That's it," said Mother. "We forgot to do the plain knitting after the purl." In spite of this rather unorthodox instruction, I have never mastered knitting either. As well as the toys and stuffed animals Auntie Gladys made for us, she made beautiful hooked rugs. Each of us was given one to put beside our beds. John's had a train on it, with his name along the side. Joan had a big butterfly, and mine was of a galleon in full sail upon a choppy sea. She always took such a delight in making things, and was always so pleased when they met with our approval. Of course, there were days at Eastbourne when it rained, and a day at the beach was impossible. That was the time to make sweets in the dark old kitchen with the antiquated gas stove and stone floor. With Auntie's help we made Turkish delight of various hues, peppermint patties, and lovely crunchy toffee. Gramps's contribution to a rainy day was to teach us card games like Old Maid or Happy Families. Early on in his career, Gramps had been the medical officer in charge of Hellingly, a large psychiatric hospital, or as it was known in those days, lunatic asylum. He was the first doctor to introduce occupational therapy to mentally ill patients. One of the results being that at a very early age I was given a set of Noah's Ark animals made by some of his patients. They were made from the wood of cigar boxes and polished to a fine sheen. For some years he was a general practitioner at Hailsham, and would visit his patients on horseback. There was a large photo at Upperton Gardens of him perched atop a large chestnut horse, complete with his doctor's bag, all ready to set off on his rounds. As soon as motor cars were available, he exchanged his faithful nag for a car. I can't think it was as reliable as his horse, because it seemed to need constant repairs. Father used to tell me he was often called upon to push the car to make it start, or help rescue it from a ditch into which it had a habit of falling, especially when Father tried to drive it. Gramps was determined that Father should also be a doctor. To that end he was sent to Epsom School, which specialised in turning out potential medical men, and then to the London hospital where he had been trained. I think it was Guy's Hospital. Father, who was of a cheerful disposition and not much given to serious study, spent most of his time joining in bizarre medical student escapades and getting into trouble with the authorities. When Gramps finally realized that his dreams for Father's future were not to be fulfilled, Father was treated as a black sheep and was packed off to the colonies to make good. He was sent to Malaya, the Malay States it was called in those days, to become a rubber planter. I have often wondered what Granny thought of this. She must have been heartbroken, but of course her opinion or wishes would never have been sought or listened to. However, two good things came of it. He escaped being involved in the First World War, and he met my mother. Judith's family, the Glasscocks, came from Bishop Stortford, and consisted of her parents and three brothers, John, Ted and Tom. When Mother was in her 20s, her mother died, and Grandpa began courting, and eventually married, a lively young German widow called Josephine, much to the horror of his children. This, and the fact she had an unhappy love affair, persuaded Mother to take a trip to Western Australia to visit her mother's twin sister, Jess, who was married to Will Davis and was living in Perth. It so happened that Father was returning to the Far East after some home leave, and he and Mother travelled on the same boat. Apparently they had, though neither knew it, a mutual friend also on board. After a couple of nights at sea, Father noticed this friend talking to a beautiful dark-haired girl who Father felt was the most attractive girl he had ever seen. He couldn't get her out of his mind, and the next day he asked his friend to introduce him to this gorgeous person. The friend said, "Certainly. Why, here she is now." And he introduced him to Mother, who had just emerged on deck. As it so happened, Mother, who was dark-haired and certainly lovely to look at, was not the girl Father had seen talking to his friend the day before. Naturally, he was disappointed, but not for long. He and Mother became inseparable for the rest of the voyage, and by the time they reached Ceylon, where Father had to disembark, he had asked her to marry him. Mother, still mourning her lost love, refused his offer and travelled on to Australia alone. She hadn't been settled in Perth for long when there was a ring at the door, and there was Father standing on the doorstep. He had followed her out to try to persuade her to change her mind. His persistence paid off, and in 1915 they were married in Shanghai Cathedral. If you have read the short stories of Somerset Maugham that are set in the Far East, you will get something of the atmosphere and background against which their life was lived. It seemed to have been full of variety and adventure, but I can remember only brief glimpses from the tales I heard, and I have no idea of their chronological order. I know that for a time Father was manager of a large rubber plantation in northern Malaya at a place called Kedah. Their bungalow was right on the edge of the jungle, and they used to use highly trained elephants to clear the land and build roads. One day they noticed a tiger walking across the lawn and disappearing into the jungle. Father grabbed his rifle and followed the footprints. After he had gone some distance into the thick undergrowth, he suddenly came to his senses and realized the jungle was a dangerous place to be in alone. So he abandoned his role of great white hunter and beat a hasty retreat. However, the rifle came in handy on another occasion. It was reported to him that a large python had got into the chicken run and was eating the chickens. Father, complete with rifle, went to investigate. He found the python curled up in a nesting box and sleeping off his huge meal. He was quickly shot, and his skin, tastefully mounted, used to hang in the sitting room in Hillingdon. It must have been over 6 feet long. Mother and Father seem to have travelled quite extensively in the Far East. There were tales of them surviving a typhoon in the China Seas, when every piece of crockery on the ship was smashed to pieces, and most of the furniture too. It was their boast that they were the only people on board who were not seasick. On another occasion, Mother was riding in a rickshaw in Yokohama when an earthquake shook the city and did quite a bit of damage. Father also tried his hand as a tea planter, and for a while they lived on a tea plantation in Ceylon. They also seem to have been in India when Father worked for the Viceroy, but in what capacity I can't imagine. It was while they were in India that they embarked on one of their strangest adventures. They joined a touring repertory company and travelled all over India acting in some of the popular plays of the day. Mother rarely talked about this experience, but Father obviously enjoyed it thoroughly. He even adopted a stage name and was known as Jack Vallance. I remember his make-up box with its sticks of grease paint and their unforgettable smell. He sometimes made us up as witches or clowns just for fun, and once he made himself up as a tramp, and suitably dressed he went round the neighbourhood asking for handouts from the neighbours. Few of them recognised him, and he got short shrift from most of those who did not. He never lost his love of the theatre, and used to say that the best seats in the house were front row centre of the upper circle. We often found ourselves occupying these seats when taken to the latest musical comedy or the variety shows at the Palladium. Father's tastes did not run to anything more profound than this, and although I saw some talented players, and it was all rather jolly, I had to wait until I was grown up to find out what great actors and playwrights were really capable of doing. In 1918, Mother became pregnant, and as the medical facilities were primitive where they happened to be at the time, she decided to head for Australia and Aunt Jess. On September the 19th, 1918, in Perth, I was born. Father, meanwhile, had joined an Indian regiment and was enjoying himself as a second lieutenant. It was the last of his efforts as an empire builder, and in 1920 we all met up again in England. He had arrived before us and was working as a clerk in the P&O Shipping Line's head office in the City of London. As the job was not very well paid, we lived in some rooms in one of the less salubrious areas of Kensington. We must have been there some while, because some of my earliest memories date from that time. I remember the worn lino on the stairs, and taking my dolls for an airing in Kensington Gardens, accompanied by Mother pushing Joan's pram. Above our flat lived a Mrs. Jagger, whom I used to visit after breakfast, so that Mother could feed and bath Joan in peace. I would arrive upstairs wearing a careworn expression, and kind-hearted Mrs. Jagger would inquire, "What's the matter, dear? Haven't you had any breakfast again?" "No," I would reply with a sigh. "Mummy is always too busy looking after the baby." I was then invited to sit at the table and was given my second breakfast for the day. It was while we lived there that I began to have terrifying nightmares. I would wake up and think that the whole room was filled with demons bent on my destruction. Familiar objects in the room turned into horrifying shapes, and unseen hands seemed to be clutching at me and holding me down. It took a superhuman effort to get out of bed and make my way to my parents' room in the dark. Mother would wake up at my frantic scrabbling in beside her and say, "Oh, Betty, you mustn't keep coming into our bed." But I, all fear now subsided, would respond with suitable pathos, "You must be kind to me, as I'm only a little girl." As you can see, I took up acting at an early age. As soon as I was old enough, I was sent to the state school in our neighbourhood. It was a grimy building that smelt of chalk and dirt and urine. It and the asphalt-covered playground were enclosed by a high brick wall. I must have been the object of some curiosity, because I remember being surrounded by grubby little faces who kept asking me questions, one being, "What does your dad do?" Of course I had no idea, and asked Mother how I should respond to this. She looked on my new friends as an unfortunate subspecies of the human race, and told me I was to say, "My daddy is a gentleman." Luckily I had the good sense not to say any such thing, even to my best friend Bubbles, a little girl of my own age. Bubbles was a street-smart Cockney child, whose ability to survive extreme poverty and a harsh virago of a mother was wonderful to behold. She introduced me to the delights of licorice bootlaces at a farthing a roll, sherbet dabs and gobstoppers that changed colour the more you sucked them. I would share my meagre allowance with Bubbles, and one day when we were penniless, I suggested that we should visit the sweet shop and see if they were giving sweets away for free that day. Bubbles doubted it, but came with me anyway, and I put my question to the shopkeeper. I was forcefully given to understand that the answer was no, and I was called a cheeky little bugger for my pains. As we retreated to the door, Bubbles said, "What do you want?" Bubbles flung back some choice remarks of her own as we made our exit. Brave, wise little Bubbles. I wonder what sort of a life she has had. During our time in London, Joan and I succumbed to many childhood diseases and were more often ill than we were well. After a particular bout of sickness, we had a visit from Gramps, who became quite alarmed at our condition. So much so that without telling anyone, of course, he bought an acre of land at Hillingdon, chose the plans for a house, and proceeded to have it built. Construction was well underway before he told my parents and took them out to see it. Father was delighted at the prospect of fresh air and a large garden to work in, but Mother was horrified. She would have preferred to have lived in London, and was very angry at not being consulted about the choice of a house and the location. The new house bordered on to 100-acre park of very old oak trees. It was part of the estate of Lord Hillingdon that was being broken up and built on. But the park became part of the green belt round London and was to remain as it was. The manor house, which we could just see among the trees in its garden, became a convent and a nursing home. The actual village of Hillingdon was some miles away, and our part of Hillingdon, in spite of the houses going up on either side of us, was still very rural. As soon as the house was built, we moved in. It was a 2-story square of red brick and was called Kedder Cottage, after the rubber estate in Malaya, and it seemed to be sitting in a sea of mud. Mother made the best of it, and coped magnificently with the lack of facilities and amenities. Cooking had to be done on a paraffin stove with a small oven. However she managed to cook so well on it, I'll never know. But she baked and roasted and turned out casseroles to perfection, as though she had used this primitive equipment all her life. The station was about a mile away, and we were on the Metropolitan and Piccadilly line, and 1 stop away from Uxbridge, the final station on the line. A few shops were going up at the bottom of Station Hill, known as the Parade. I remember being sent to the baker's to buy fresh hot cross buns on Good Friday before breakfast. They cost a halfpenny each.